We want to be open, we want allies, we want good friends, we want partners. But we always want to be in a situation to choose them, not to be 100% dependent on them. European sovereignty is not just a concept or a fantasy, but it's absolutely, in a dangerous world, a necessity to live, dream for ourselves.
These were the French president's words after a state visit to the Netherlands in April this year. Isn't that some loving and caring thoughts of a statesman? But does President Macron think the same way for the 14 African countries that France is still colonizing? Hello and welcome again to the Age of Politics podcast. Geopolitical Queen here with today's episode on how France sets exceptional rules for themselves whilst exploiting its former colonies in Africa to their last breath. According to President Macron,
and I want to insist on that, identity and sovereignty are intertwined. And I think this is very important to understand this link and the fact that Spinoza makes it as one of the founding concepts of precisely political philosophy. Because if you accept to lose your sovereignty, it means if you accept to depend on other powers, you put yourself in a situation not to decide for yourself and not to be in charge of precisely continuing our future model for ourselves. And for me, this new doctrine should be based on 5 pillars. The first one is very well known, but I want to insist on that. This is, I would say, the native one of our European Union. This is competitiveness and a stronger and a better European integration. This is the first pillar, and this is very important because you cannot be a strong role model, you cannot promote your identity, you cannot defend on the long run the European model if you are not competitive and you don't put yourself in a situation to be the one to produce the best-in-class solutions. This is why competitiveness is requested, and this is why you have to pass reforms, referring to what happened at the beginning of our discussions. Indeed, for instance, just an anecdote to illustrate. You cannot live in a continent if you decide not to be competitive at a country basis and you just leave competitiveness to the others. You kill your economy, but you put the whole continent in a situation not to be competitive and in a certain way not to produce any more in your place. How to produce aircrafts, cars, but even software or anything else if you are not competitive? The customers you are will refuse to buy at such.
Macron also emphasized that Europe shall not become a vassal of the US or China and must avoid being drawn into the conflict over Taiwan. This is not the first time that Macron has pushed for such an European strategic autonomy, but this time it has drawn significant criticisms from across the pond. This, however, has not deterred Macron in any way as he embarks on his vision for a more sovereign Europe. This he explains in his 5-pillar plan. The first pillar is competitiveness and a better European integration to be achieved by passing reforms, simplification and streamlining of regulation, more innovation, implementation of competitive labor laws, and investing in human capital. He also said that you cannot be a strong role model, promote your identity, defend your identity, and in the long run, the European model, if you are not competitive and you don't put yourself in a situation to be the one to produce the best-in-class solutions. But let's compare Macron's words to the way France treats its African colonies. France imposed colonial debt for the benefit of France's colonization on the newly independent countries. These countries had to pay for the infrastructure built by France during the colonization period. For example, in Côte d'Ivoire, rent for their parliament house is paid to France every month because France claims they built it for them. Failure to do so implies that the building will be destroyed. Let's take a look at Togo. Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of the Republic of Togo, a tiny country in West Africa, found a middle ground solution with the French. He didn't want his country to continue to be a French dominion, so he refused to sign the Colonization Continuation Pact that President de Gaulle at the time proposed, but rather he agreed to pay an annual debt to France for the so-called benefits Togo got from French colonization. It was the early conditions for the French not to destroy the country before leaving. The estimated amount by France at the time was about 40% of the country's budget as at 1963. The financial situation of the newly independent Togo became very unstable. So to enable Togo to get out of the situation, Olympio decided to get out of the French colonial currency FCFA and issue the country's own currency. On January 13, 1963, 3 days after the printing of this currency began, a squad of illiterate soldiers backed by France killed the first elected president of the newly independent African country known as Togo. Olympio was killed by an ex-French Foreign Legionnaire Army sergeant called Etienne Nassimbe, who supposedly received a bounty of $612 at the time from the local French embassy for the head man job. Olympio's dream was to build an independent, self-sufficient, and self-reliant country. But the French, who are now fighting for competitiveness and a better European integration, refused to allow a Togo to have this chance to compete in Africa. Now let's listen in to Macron again.
Let me express by taking one example. If you don't have industrial policy, you cannot create progressively your autonomy, or at least your de-risking on energy. This is impossible. If you don't have a political an interference, I would say, or an intervention of industrial policy, you cannot create your own net zero industry. You cannot create or strengthen your own chips industry, because the other powers.
Macron's second pillar is to create industrial policies. As Macron points out, If you don't have industrial policies, you cannot create your autonomy progressively, or at least you are de-risking dependency on energy from other countries. Macron also argues that without that, we cannot achieve a net zero economy, energy autonomy, or strengthen our chips industry, as China and the US have a competitive advantage due to their policies. But hold on. Has Macron forgotten that France has a law for its African colonies, which gives France the first right to buy any natural resources or the first refusal right to any raw or natural resource discovered in the African country? It is only after France decides not to be interested in the resources that the African countries are allowed to seek other partners. Let's take a look at Guinea on this point. When President Sekou Touré of Guinea decided in 1958 to get out of the French colonial empire, the French colonial elite in Paris got so furious and, in a historic act of fury, destroyed everything in the country, which represented that they called the benefits from French colonization. 3,000 French nationals left the country, taking all their properties and destroying anything that could not be moved, ranging from school buildings, nurseries, public administration buildings, cars, books, medicine research institute instruments, tractors were all turned into scrap. Even horses and cows on the farms were killed. Food in warehouses were burnt or poisoned. The purpose of this outrageous act was to send a clear message to all other colonies that the consequences for rejecting France would be very high. Fear spread through the African elite, and none, after the Guinea events, ever found the courage to follow the example of Sekou Touré, whose slogan was, and I quote, "We prefer freedom in poverty to opulence in slavery." Was this the perfect act of industrialization, which Macron is lecturing us on today and advocating for the creation of industrial policies? Let's listen in again.